It's the Real News Network, and I'm Greg Wilpert, coming to you today from New York City, where I'm at the 2019 Left Forum, which takes place annually in this big city, this time actually in Brooklyn. I'm joining you today, or actually joining me today, is Victor Grossman. Victor is a journalist and writer who was born in 1928 and originally came from the United States, but eventually defected to East Germany, to the German Democratic Republic in the 1950s. And while there, he grew up there and continued working and living in East Germany and reporting about things that were happening there, especially also after German unification, and has written a number of books, one of them an autobiography, and recently came out with a new book called A Socialist Defector, From Harvard to Karl-Marx-Allee, in which he chronicles his thoughts about German society and his life in East Germany and in West, or in the unified, I should say, unified Germany. Thanks, Victor, for joining me today.
Glad to be here.
So let's start with why you decided to write this book. What was your motivation? Why did you want to focus on, put out this book, which is actually a fairly long book, over 300 pages. What was your motivation?
The main reason was that, not that I consider myself particularly clever being so old, but after having lived 24 years in the United States, 38 years in East Germany, or GDR, and then 30 years in United Germany, I had experiences in comparing them, which I thought could and should be perhaps of interest to American, especially American audiences. Most particularly, I thought young audiences who are now often searching for answers to the problems of the day, of society, today's society. I wanted to give them some of the results of my own thoughts, considerations, and views on what I had experienced in these three very different societies.
Well, we can't cover the entire book now, but let's cover some of these experiences that you're talking about. And so I want to start with the comparison between your experience in the United States before going to Germany, which was basically from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s until the time that you decided to defect. And why you defected, and then make that comparison, what life was like in East Germany in the 1960s and 70s and even 80s when you were living there. How do those 3 decades before your defection and after your defection compare to one another?
That's the best part of the book. But the reason I left was that having grown up in the late 1930s in New York, and in a left-wing family, I was a so-called red diaper baby, I was very much leaning to the left, and actively, as a result of what I had seen of the Depression, what I had seen of racism, which I rejected it from childhood, and from events like the Civil War in Spain, which affected me greatly, the fight against Mussolini and Hitler. This all made me into a leftist. So that when I got to Harvard, I was actually recruited into the secretive Communist Party. Secretive, we were afraid of being known as such because of our futures, but we were active in just those questions against racism, for union rights, and for peace, against atomic increase. And this made me an active leftist, so much so that when I left college, Harvard, in 1949, I went to work in 2 factories because the trade union movement seemed the most important movement in the United States, the most important sphere. I was there a year and a half in Buffalo, but then came the Korean War. I had been just too young to get drafted into the Second World War, but now I was drafted. And when you were drafted in those days, you had to sign a statement never had to have been in any leftist organization. And there was a long, 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 long list, most of them long since gone. I had been in about a dozen, and was still in about half a dozen, including the Communist Party and Spanish Relief, Southern Negro Youth Congress, and others. But if I admitted that I had been in them, there was a law which said I should have long ago reported to the police department as a foreign agent. And if I didn't, there was a possible penalty of up to 5 years for every day I didn't report. That was the McCarran Act. And that meant after a week, 35 years, and 2 weeks, 70 years. I panicked at the idea of this. The law was already 6 months old. And therefore, I signed the statement saying I had never been in any such organization, in the hopes if I kept my nose clean and my mouth shut, maybe they wouldn't check up on me for 2 years' service. But I was lucky. First, I didn't get sent to Korea. I got sent to West Germany. But they did check up and sent me a letter saying, you signed that statement, although you were in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Report on Monday to the military judge in nearby Nuremberg. For having lied, there was again a possible penalty up to 5 years and $10,000. This panicked me again, even worse. I didn't want to spend 5 years in a penitentiary, a military. So I decided to take off and went to Austria, where the dividing line was the Danube River, and that's where I swam across and got to the Soviets. And they brought me to East Germany, to the German Democratic Republic, without my having asked for it. I just wanted to get away from prison. But they took me to East Germany.
And so once you got there, how was it? What was it like? I mean, I'm sure it was a complicated process, and we don't have time to go into all of the details, but you eventually started working. What did you do? And then how did you perceive that living under the what some call state socialist or communist government of East Germany, of the GDR, and how did that compare to your life previously?
First of all, I was sent to a town where many deserters from Western countries were sent. In this town, there were about 15 Americans, about 10 Britons, about 6 Frenchmen, Moroccans who did not want to serve in the French army in Vietnam, and a few others. I worked there in a factory, again for 5 months, hauling lumber. But then the Soviets and then later the GDR authorities took over. They had a special 1-year apprenticeship to learn a trade. Most of these fellows that were with me had not. I learned to run a lathe, but then after 1 year learning, I was able to leave that small town and go to Leipzig to the university to study journalism for 4 years. This gives me the unusual title. I'm the only person in the world who has a diploma from both Harvard and the Karl-Marx University. And I'll keep this rule because it's no longer called that, so I'm staying the only person. After that, I went to East Berlin and had various jobs before including one as director of an archive about the life of Paul Robeson, the great Afro-American singer and actor. But then I became a freelance journalist and speaker and found in general that the GDR was far more complicated than most people think. An awful lot of people think only when they hear of this East Germany of either the Stasi or the wall, or maybe sport drugs. It was a much, much more normal life than people really think. It was not like that life in the United States. But in many ways, for the average person, it wasn't that different. He went to work his 8 hours. He couldn't get fired, by the way. People couldn't get fired in the GDR unless they were really convicted of something. And then they still needed approval by the union. But I found that, first of all, there was no fear of being fired. Second of all, although there were many, many shortages, all through the years, fewer and fewer, and the shortages became more and more exclusive, if I might say so. In the early years, there were always certain important living things for life that were in short supply, where you sometimes had to stand on line. There was always enough to eat, but not what you wanted always. And the same was true of clothing and of other things. That got better and better, so that the things you couldn't get was no longer difficulty in finding a wash rag, or for a few months you couldn't get a razor blade. You had to have your old one sharpened. It became getting blue tiles for your bathroom became hard to get, or parts for your car often were difficult. But I accepted these difficulties. I may have scolded about them and grumbled, but I accepted them because the idea of taking all the factories there and enterprise away from the war criminals who had built up Hitler and during the war had used slave labor, tens of thousands of people from concentration camps and POWs, including my cousin who was killed in the process. They threw all these big companies out. They all went to West Germany. They were all out so that there were no big private companies, and I liked that idea. That I felt was good, that nobody's making money off my work or anybody else's work. Of course, there was lots of dissatisfaction too, especially because West Germany was, first of all, much bigger, much richer, and got Marshall Plan money and paid almost no war reparations, where East Germany paid almost all of them. So that the life there, for many reasons, was much more commodities, almost like in the United States. In East Germany, for the latest fashion or specialty, you had to run and look and search, and you weren't always lucky. And this and other reasons first of all, caused dissatisfaction and dissatisfaction with West Germany always claiming East Germany belongs to us too, we want to unite on our basis, meant that the ruling people in East Germany were afraid of being forcibly perhaps joined to West Germany, and therefore there was a great deal of keeping to the line, of not free media in the media, of pressures to keep to this given line, and checking on people by the Stasi. This affected basically almost exclusively those people who were somehow organizing in dissent. The normal person went about his daily life, went to work, went to the football game, or the soccer game rather, on the weekend, could go to movies or the theater or a magnificent opera for very, very little money, and paid very little for rent. He paid less than 10%. And all medical care was covered by a small tax, dental care too. So he had very few of these worries. He had, since rents were capped at the 1945 level, and since most staple foods were capped at the 1958 level, and since you didn't pay anything more for medical care, and college education was free, and you got 200 marks a month to cover expenses, this meant that people had most people had money in their pockets, but never caught up with, the supply never caught up with demand. So they looked jealously in Western television, or if they did get to visit West Germany, at the wonderful life there, which they thought was heavenly, that they would have everything then without any problems. And that is why there was great dissatisfaction and also great pressure.
Well, let's fast forward past that period, though. I mean, it's a period, talking about the period of German unification, was a period that happened relatively quickly and was with tremendous amount of upheaval. We were talking earlier about the possibility of something like 4 million people losing their jobs, unemployment rising to 25%. Eventually, things stabilized. Still, the unemployment rate is still higher in East Germany than it is in West Germany after German unification, which took place in 1990. But I want to fast forward to today and make the comparison now. There's not that many people who are actually, I mean, well, there are a lot of people, but the people who experience both systems, that is under East Germany and under the post-United Germany, have to be more or less in their 50s and 60s now, or older, in order to make that comparison, because anybody who's less than 30 obviously wasn't even born. So it's a memory that is really fading very quickly. So I want to know, among those people who are able to make that comparison, and you're one of those, how do they perceive now this 30 years after unification period compared to before unification, in terms of what the differences are, the advantages and disadvantages?
I would say, at my own very rough estimate, that over these 30 years, it's come to a point where roughly 1/3 are doing much better than before. About 1/3 are doing about the same, and about 1/3 are doing worse than before. Of course, everyone can now travel to wherever they want to and can find any commodity they want to if they can afford them. But at present, and especially since the crisis of 2007, 2008, many people, but especially in the East, there's a great feeling of disillusionment. Those promised blossoming landscapes, which Chancellor Kohl promised, have not really transpired. Whole areas, especially in the South, are pretty desolate, with very few jobs, because in many towns there's one big factory. Everyone either worked there or worked in some kind of servicing for the people who did work there. When it closed, there's nothing. Most of the people left, at least the young people. And so you have villages and towns dying, plus a great deal, even when they do have jobs, especially in certain centers have been built up, like Leipzig and Dresden. In general, there is a fairly wide feeling of disillusionment. This does not mean that a lot of these old timers say, we wish it were the GDR again. But a lot of them say, well, in the GDR, there was lots we didn't like, but at least we didn't have to worry about a job. And we didn't have to worry about medical expenses, about getting dentures or hearing aids or such expenses. And there's this feeling which is mixed in many of these old people. Sometimes their children and grandchildren have gotten that, sometimes they haven't received that. This disillusionment has led in East Germany to some people just turning off politics. They said, they're all no good. Others turned to whatever seemed to be against the establishment. This is in the last few years. Whether it was Angela Merkel's party or the Social Democratic Party, which always ruled the roost in Germany up to now, they've turned away very much from these, either to the Green Party, which is not like the Greens in the United States. It's not a leftist party, really, but to the Greens Party, which they see as not part of the establishment and working for environment, or many of them to this fascist party called Alternative for Germany, or almost fascist party, which says all your problems, your difficulties are because of these foreigners who are coming in, these immigrants, these refugees. That's a big problem. Hate the Muslims, a sentiment you can find in other countries as well. Hate the Muslims, and sometimes anti-Semitic too, but mostly hate the Muslims because that's the largest group are Muslim. And this has created a very dangerous situation where the left party, it's called the Linke in German, has also received some of the disillusionment, but not so much as it hoped, because it has also become almost a part of the establishment in East Germany, not in the West. It's become part of various governments, and to my way of thinking, it hasn't fought enough for people's rights in the streets, in the factories, in the colleges, or wherever people gather, unemployment offices, where they often gather, I'm afraid, also. It has to my view, reach people and get them moving. I think this is something I believe not only for Germany, for the United States as well, and for every other country.
Now, turning towards the kind of, again, the purpose of your writing this book, A Socialist Defector, what are some of the lessons that you think one can draw from these experiences that you've had in terms of comparing the capitalist system of Germany, of the United Germany, with the state socialist, I like to use that term, state socialist system of the GDR or East Germany?
Well, there's one saying that made the rounds among working people a few years after this big change. They said in GDR days, if you were smart, you didn't make nasty cracks or sharp criticisms against the political leaders in the government or at the top. If you were wise, you didn't, and at least not publicly. But you could say anything you want against the foreman or the manager, because you couldn't be fired. Now it's the other way around. You can say anything you want against the people at the top, and you have free elections to choose them, but you better not say anything against your foreman when he calls you in to work overtime or calls you in on a weekend or for anything else. Then you could lose your job. This shows that East Germany, the GDR, was really, in many ways, a contradictory system. It had many, many good features. For example, I read in the United States and today's Germany about the so-called pantry, giving out free foods to people who don't have enough. That's common in Germany today as it is here, I think. We never knew of such a thing in the GDR. Everybody had enough food. We had not a single soul in 38 years. I couldn't see one soul sleeping in the street or in a park because it was illegal to throw people out of their homes. That was illegal. If they didn't pay rent for 2 years or 3, you might have to, force them to move into a cheaper apartment, but you couldn't throw them on the street. These are some of the things which I still compare. Now visiting the United States, I settled in East Berlin, but I'm visiting now for several months, and seeing people, especially I saw them in Los Angeles and San Francisco, but it's otherwise in these tent towns and just sleeping in the street. And now in Berlin as well, east and west. This hurts me. I think that's an obscenity to have people sleeping in the streets or in the subway stations as we did. And the same is true of people standing on line, long lines for free medical treatment or dental treatment, when with us, you made an appointment with a doctor or a dentist, you might have to wait a couple of weeks, but then you went and you didn't give him a penny. And when he prescribed a drug, you went to the pharmacy and you got the drug and you didn't pay anything extra. These things always impressed me in living there because I had the comparison with the United States. And it hurts me. No, let me put it another way. It does hurt me, but I think somehow people in the United States have to achieve that too. Because in this sense, not in terms of elections or democratic freedoms, the GDR was well behind because it felt itself menaced all the time. But in such social questions, free childcare, free abortions for women if they wanted them, all of these things meant an awful lot in your life. And they meant a lot for me. And that's why, although I was constantly angry at the government, or the leadership, was mostly in the party leadership, for not understanding how to sell this to their own population. They never really learned good sales methods, such as Madison Avenue was an expert. They were talked, boring, the same thing all the time. People turned it off. This was one reason why it went down the drain. They never could make people realize that these were their own achievements, this medical care and so forth, and it belonged to them, and it would be cut, if not dropped, if they lose the system, and if those big companies move back in again, and they have. They've all moved back in again and have taken over again, and have, since the unification, until unification, no German soldier served abroad as a German soldier. Now, Germany, soon after unification, Germany was involved dropping bombs in Serbia, Yugoslavia, dropping bombs in Afghanistan, fighting in Mali and Africa, sending military ship, navy to Lebanon. It's moving, it's expanding. Germany is very strong in Europe. It's not as strong as the USA, but in Europe it's strongest. And I worry about that because it's the same people who built up Hitler, not the same people, they're dead, but the same forces or companies which built up Hitler are now back in the saddle again.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much. I'm speaking to Victor Grossman, author of the book A Socialist Defector from Harvard to Karl-Marx-Allee. Thanks again, Victor, for having joined us today.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.